So we're opening up now to Sadi Tes Amid Beis, Arvei Pesachim. Now, the first question I want to ask you is, what's the name of this Perek? That's not clear. There are two girsos. In fact, in my Gemara, the girsa that I have is Erev Pesachim. Now, the trouble with this Masechta, or this Perek, I should say, is that we don't have Rashi. We have something that might be Rashi, but the scholars assume it's not Rashi. So what we have is Rashi's grandson, the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Shmuel. He was a Talmud of Rashi, and whole different style of writing than Rashi. Now, the Rashbam's Girsa is what we classically we know this Perek as Arvei Pesachim. But if you take a look at Tosfos, Tosfos's Girsa in our Mishnah is Erev Pesachim. And truth be told, Tosfos's Girsa makes a lot more sense, because our Mishnah is only going to deal with one Erev Pesach, not Arvei Pesachim. Tosfos justifies the Girsa of the Rashbam by saying that Igar Sinon Arvei Nicha. We can somehow figure it out. Arvei Pesachim means for you, for me. You know, in general, there are many people celebrating, commemorating Arvei Pesachim. Inami Erev Pesach Rishon V'Sheni, perhaps. Arvei in the plural is referring to both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. That has to be taken under advisement, because I'm not sure if everything we're going to learn about in our Mishnah applies to Pesach Sheni as we go along. Okay, now keep in mind, of course, historically, that on the night of the 15th, our ancestors left Mitzrayim, and the Torah commands us to eat the Korban Pesach together with matzah and maror. And the pasuk says in Bo, "V'yachlu es habasar b'layla zetzli eishu matzos al marorim yochluhu." Torah also commands us on this night to be mesaper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. And it says, "V'hoyak yishalcha bincha mochar lemor mazos v'yamarti lo b'chozik yado tziyonu Hashem mitzrayim mibeis avadim." So all that is Doraisa: Pesach, Matzah, Maror, and Sipur. And the Chachamim were Mesaken Shtias Arba Kosas, drinking 4 cups of wine. And at the same time, they established the mitzvah of Heseva, of reclining. But without further ado, let's learn the Mishnah. Arvei Pesachim, Samuch lemincha, lo yochal odom ad shetechshach. There seems to be a separate halacha. Actually, every Erev Yontif, we abstain from eating Samuch lemincha. We starve ourselves, so to speak, from a point of Samuch lemincha. So what's the unique halacha here that applies to Erev Pesach? How is it different than any Erev Yontif? We could always say Lo Yochal Odom Ad Shetechsha. Now, let me ask, what does it mean, Samuch lemincha, and what does it mean when it says lo yochal? Does lo yochal mean you're not allowed to start a meal, or you're not allowed to eat, even if you started earlier than this time period? So we have to know what Samuch lemincha is, and when does he start his meal? If you're telling me he's starting his meal after Samuch lemincha, that's for sure prohibited. If you're saying he started his meal before that point of Plaga Mincha, maybe of Mincha, of Samuch lemincha, then maybe we can give him a little bit more leniency, a little more rope to allow him to continue a meal that he started beheter. So I'm going to read to you the note here on the bottom. He says, "Zman tfilas minchu achar sheish shos umechza mitchilas hayom." These are what we call shos manios. Anyway, it's 6.5 hours into the day. We would call 12:30. Ad ha'erev, until sunset. Shehu hazman hechsher shchitas korban pesach. In other words, from 6.5 hours until sunset is the time period allotted for shchitas haPesach. Now, what's a little bit confusing is when we come up with the Sheshu Mechza, we added a half hour past Chatzos Hayom. And that half hour could be understood in or explained in two ways. It could be because we're not sure exactly where. Do you remember we discussed at the beginning of Talmud Nishkat that, until the sun starts tilting towards the west, you're not sure that you reached Chatzos Hayom. But on a derisive level, if you knew for sure when is Chatzos Hayom, that would be the earliest time for the Shchitas HaPesach. But there might be another explanation as to why we want to wait a little bit longer, and that has to do with the fact that the Pesach has the exceptional status that doesn't appear anywhere in any other korban, in that the Pesach starts after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. So we want to give a little bit of a time period for the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim and delay the Korban Pesach. If you were to bring the Korban Pesach exactly at Chatzos, that would be before the Korban Tamid, and the Torah tells us no, that the Pesach should be brought after the Korban Tamid. Now it's interesting that Mincha, which is one of the three tefillos on a regular day, was established keneged Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, because we paskin that keneged Karbanas Tiknu. So we have the Tamid Shel Shachar, Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, and we have the Hekter Chalav Veivar. So that Tfilas Mincha was established at the moment of the Karban of Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. Now, the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, so that we understand when it's Mincha, is itself divided into two parts. From Teshu Mechza, which is the time period that they shechted the Korban Pesach. I'm sorry, scratch that. The time that they shechted the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim on a daily basis, that was called Teshu Mechza. And that's what we learned earlier in Talmud Nishkat. Nikras man mincha ktana. So Teshu Mechza is mincha ktana. The earlier time period is called mincha gedola. Here in our Mishnah, we're talking about mincha ktana. In other words, we don't want you to set up a seuda later than the time of mincha. Now, mincha here is going to be the time that we established for tfilas mincha, which is the time for the hakrova, the shchita of the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. So that's how we get to the conclusion that we're talking about Teshu Mechza. So, for example, it's already noon. The clock has struck 12 noon. Am I allowed to eat a meal? The answer is yes. I can still eat a meal because I haven't yet gotten to Teshu Mechza. Now he quotes the Ran. The Ran says that when it says lo yochal adam, etc., that's referring to lo yaschil le'echal. Achim kvar hischil le'echal kodem lechem. Eino tzarich lahafsik ad chashech. Now, in all circumstances, no matter what, comes nightfall, you have to stop eating. There's no zero tolerance for eating after nightfall. However, when we go back in time to the period of time before nightfall, so the Ran says that when it says lo yochal samach lemincha, we're talking about lo yaschil. That's how we have to understand the Mishnah, says the Ran. Lo yaschil, you cannot kick off your seuda when it's samach lemincha. But it doesn't mean that there's an absolute Isser of eating before nightfall. That's not true, because according to the Ran, if you had kicked off your meal before Samach Lamincha, which we said was 9.5 hours, then you're allowed to continue your meal even beyond that point. Now, a lot of the Rishonim are worried about something called Shema Timoshech Su'udasa. It's very nice that you started your Su'uda before Mincha Ketana, but how do we know that you won't be Moshech Yasuda, you won't continue Yasuda? He says that Imu Yodea, the Shitas Rashbam and others, Imu Yodea Shetimoshech Sudaso Achar Teisha shows. So again, he's starting his meal before the time of the, but he knows that he's going to continue into the time. He's so lo yaschil. He should not begin. So you get the impression here that this is a bone of contention in the Rishon, the Ran seems to say that there's no problem of continuing a meal that you started beheter, started an earlier moment. And the whole Easter is to set up a meal after that time, after Teisha Shosumeth. However, other Rishonim are assuming, Rashi and others, that there's an Easter Achila from Teisha Mechza on, even if you had started your meal before. But he does add that Yodea Shetimoshech Sudas. He knows when he started his meal that it's going to go and continue beyond Teisha Mechza, implying that if he was unaware of that, his expectation was that they would finish the meal Bi'od Moed, within the time framework. Then that's a different story. Now, I asked you the following question: what makes this Easter unique, Erev Pesach? So first of all, I refer to the Rashbam. The Rashbam says Kidei shebelayla yelo te'ova, that he should eat the matzah with gusto. That he really is waiting for the matzah. If he has a full belly. And he writes that the mitzvah of eating matzah l'te'ovon with a certain level of hunger and appetite, that is considered hidur mitzvah. Okay, there's a lot here to talk about because some Rishonim hold that it's not a matter of hidur mitzvah, but it could be that you'll be involved in what's called an achila gasa, and that's not an achila at all, and that would nullify and undermine his mitzvah of matzah. But anyway, let's go with the Rashbam. The Rashbam is saying that there's a kiyum of zeh keli v'anvei of hidur mitzvah when you eat the matzah with that extra passion, that extra excitement, because you abstain from eating sometime before that. Now, the next part of the Mishnah is something that I want to discuss with you at great length. Afilu ani sheb'Yisrael lo yochal ad sheyosef. And the Mishnah is telling me that the mitzvah of Heseva applies equally to both an usher and an ani. Now, what about, okay, fine, Haseba, but what about Dalit Kosos? That's the next part of the mission. For Yivchasu Lo, this is a reference to the Gaboy Tztaka, the Arba Kosos Shel Yain, Lafil Min Atam. Tamchui is what we call in English a soup kitchen. And it facilitated the real destitute people that didn't have money for a meal just to eat a Suda, so that the money was earmarked for 2 sudos, maximum 2 sudos. That money, tamchui, is perhaps the most critical money of tzedakah that we know of. We don't dispense with that money for other purposes other than shtei seudos, to give an ani 2 seudos worth of money, that he could buy 2 seudos. And yet the Mishnah says, and it's a big chiddush, that there's one mitzvah for which we could take that money that's earmarked and classified as tamchui, and we can reallocate it. And that's the mitzvah of Daled Kosos. Now, I want you to underline one word in the Mishnah, because Tosos is going to build mountains on one word, a word that you can easily have missed if you blink. And that's the word lo, lamed vav. Lo yifchesu lo, mi arba kosos. Vus epis, asks Tosos, did the Mishnah feel compelled to add the word lo? Leave out the word lo. Or talk about lohem. You know, imagine a man is the head of a household that has his wife and 5 children, and he doesn't have money to buy Daled Kosos. Why does it say lo yifchesu lo in the singular? Is the Mishnah somehow hinting to me that when he comes forward to request funds for Daled Kosos, he is advocating on his own behalf? He's not advocating for the entire family. Instead of giving him wine for 7 human beings, we're going to give him wine for 1 human being. Lo in the singular. You'll see this now. The Tosos has 3 levels to it. So we're talking at the bottom level. The first line, it says lo yifchesu lo. Pirish Rashbam. No, I'm sorry. There are 2 Tosos in that start the same. Drop down to the second one. Lo yifchesu lo. Me'arba kosos. Mitoch haloshon mashma ktsas. You get the impression that ain't nosnim lebanav ulebnei beso ki im liatzma. Let's stop here for a moment. Imagine the difference financially in terms of how much money we're depleting the funds of the soup kitchen. If it's for one person, that's Daled Kosos. Let's say that each costs you 10 shekel. So you're talking about 40 shekel. If you would talk about a family of a wife and 5 children, now you're up to 7 nefashos, and then you can end up with almost 50 cups of wine. That's a whole different ballgame. And Tosos wants to suggest that all we have to do is supply him, i.e. head of household, with 4 cups of wine. I exaggerate when I said 50. So that would be in a larger family. Now, what are we prejudiced against the wife and against the children? In halacha, I mean, the only special status that the Balabais has is in terms of Ner Chanukah, maybe has a special chiyuv. And we once spoke about Korban Pesach, that he can be mamana whoever he wants in his family against their will. You remember that discussion we had? But basically, as far as the chiyuv of Dalid Kosos is concerned, what difference it make whether it's him or his bnei bias? I mean, again, if they're ketanim, it's a different issue. That's only chiyuv. Fine. So Tosos adds a few words. He says, "Ki imli atzmo v'hu motzias kulam b'shalom." Do you have it? I want you to know, Rabbosai, if you're a brisker lamdin, those words are very, very difficult. For who motzi es kulam b'shalom. Now, if Tosis would have said this, and you're a brisker lamdin, say, all right, maybe he didn't mean it. He wasn't serious. We'll fluff it up a little bit. But Tosis is pretty darn serious. It's not just a diuk in the word lo. He says usvaro. The maishna arba kosos mikosos shel kiddush dechol hashana she'echad motzi es kulam. I mean, it's very nice. You give out a little bit of the wine to the people at the table, but that's not required. All you need is that the Makadesh have one cup of wine. You can have, I remember when we were in the army, we had sometimes hundreds of soldiers that we yotze with one cup of wine, of Kiddush. I tried to get there fast to get a front seat because I wanted to hear the Kiddush. This is amazing. Tosas equates Dalit Kosos with a kosher Kiddush. What kind of business is this? Kosher Kiddush is a mitzvah of Siddur Bracha ala Kos. The mitzvah is the bracha of Kiddush. As I'll say, make the bracha over a cup of wine. That's not what Dalit Kosos is about. Dalit Kosos is about shtia. It's about drinking the Kosos. The Gemara over and over again uses the term derech cherus. And you need heseva. And you need yayin mozug. You can't use yayin chai. And lefi daito, so everyone decides which wine he wants to drink, and so forth and so on. The Ramban goes very far. The Ramban says if you have a large kos that has many revios in it, you have to drink rov kos. But you see that the dinim in shtia here, it's not, in truth, Kiddush doesn't require shtia. I'll prove it to you. Kiddush requires te'ima. You have to taste from the kos. And I'll prove it to you because the halacha is that even the Makadosh himself doesn't have to drink the entire kos. He could divvy it up amongst many different people. He didn't drink it all from the kos. That's not so in Dalit Kosos. Dalit Kosos means that I'm obligated to drink the kos. That's how I demonstrate my freedom. Chayav adam liros es atzmo. This is a very, very difficult tosos. And this Tosfos actually came up in a famous discussion between two brothers, two great rabbis, in the city of Chaslavich. For those of you who know a little bit about Rav Soloveitchik, he was raised as a child in the city of Chaslavich in White Russia. And his father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, was the Rav in Chaslavich. And there was one particular Pesach where the Rav of Brisk, who was Rav Moshe Soloveitchik's younger brother, Rav Velvel Brisker, the Brisker Rav, spent Pesach in his brother's house in Chaslavich. And because of the situation in Poland at that time, Poland and Russia, they could not get access to wine for the Dalit Kosos on Leil HaSeder. They had access to what's called raisin wine. Rushikas. And the issue that came up in discussion was the following issue. Do we have to guarantee that every single person at the Seder table be supplied with 4 cups of raisin wine? Or is it enough that the Makadesh, the head of household, will be provided with Dalid Kosos of raisin wine, and he'll be motzi everybody else? They'll listen carefully, and everybody else will be yotz. So what would be your sort of knee-jerk response? We talk about derech cherus, and we drink 4 cups of wine. Should we guarantee that every single person at the Seder table get the raisin wine? Anybody? I only see one face, so John, what would you say? Well, give me your knee-jerk response. I'll give you 2 options. What?
I'd say against Tosfos.
Yeah, you would mean what? That we supply every single person, no?
Yeah.
Okay. So Moshe said no, and his brother agreed. All we have to have is that the head of household be supplied with the 4 cups of raisin wine. Why? He said the following. You cannot be Mekayim the mitzvah of derech cherus on raisin wine. You need yayin. Raisin wine will serve for what we call Siddur Bracha ala Kos. When Chazal established that any bracha requires a Siddur Bracha ala Kos, raisin wine will be sufficient. Now, as far as Siddur Bracha ala Kos is concerned, shtia is not an integral part of that mitzvah. So whatever will salvage by supplying raisin wine is only Siddur Bracha ala Kos. There won't be any kiyum of derech cherus. And therefore, shtia is no longer an issue because no one, not even the Makadesh who has the raisin wine, is going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of derech cherus. You therefore gain absolutely nothing by supplying every member of the household with raisin wine, because raisin wine here is only functioning in one capacity for the kiyum of Siddur Bracha ala Kos. And from the perspective of Siddur Bracha ala Kos, echad motzi is kulam. One recites the bracha. Everyone at the table hears his bracha and fulfills his obligation. But as far as shtiyah and akos is concerned, we need derech cherus, and raisin wine is not derech cherus. And if it's not derech cherus, you're left with Siddur Bracha ala Kos without shtiyah. And once you drop the element of shtiyah, the requirement of shtiyah, because we don't have wine, then there's no reason or rhyme. It's not even a chumrah here that we should supply everyone at the table with raisin wine. I mean, again, the brilliance of these minds. I mean, I promise you that anyone in that situation would have said exactly what John said. This is a mitzvah of Dalit Kosas. Give everyone Dalit Kosas. But what you see clearly from the minds of these two Soloveitchiks is that there are 2 different dimensions or elements in the mitzvah of Dalit Kosas. We have 4 cups of wine. Each one has its respective bracha. We have 4 brachos. We've got Birchas HaKiddush, and then we have Birchas Gal Yisrael on Magid. Then we have Birchas HaMazon after we finish the Suda, and finally Birchas HaHalel. Every one of the 4 cups was established as a bracha, as a koshel bracha. But there's another dimension, and that is the mitzvah of derech cherus, which is the mitzvah of shtia, to drink the kos. So there's an overlap, generally speaking, of these 2 elements. On rare occasions, unfortunately, we have to drop one of the 2 elements. For example, if you don't have wine, you have raisin wine. Again, I wouldn't give you the example of beer because beer classically is chametz, so we're not going to use that for Dalit Kosos, but raisin wine, and maybe there are other cases that would suffice for Siddur Bracha ala Kos. Maybe if there's no kidneys issue, you could use Coca-Cola. I don't know. But that's Siddur Bracha ala Kos, but you're missing, in those cases, the element of Shtia derech cherus because you simply don't have it. Onus Rachman and Patra. So that leads us back to the difficulty that we began with. Tosfos says that in the case of these destitute individuals, we don't have to supply every member of the family with Dalit Kosos, just the Balabayas, and it's no different than Kiddush. Well, it is different than Kiddush. Kiddush is only seed of Brach al Kos, but Dalit Kosos means Dalit Kosos Shtia, Derech Eretz. If you don't supply every member of the, you see, my Shtia of Derech Eretz cannot help you. You need a Shtia Derech Eretz. I can be Yotzi me with a bracha because of the halacha, the principle of Shomea Ka'ona. That makes sense. But as far as drinking Derech Eretz, there's no such thing as enjoying Derech Eretz through someone else's Shtia. That's a mitzvah shebegufo. That's not something that you can vicariously experience Shtia Derech Eretz. So for sure, we should have to supply everyone. I mean, Tosas maybe he's talking about a case where the tamchui is depleted and there's not enough money, or we have to worry about other needs that have to be fulfilled with the tamchui money. So at least let's get the cedar brach ala kos. Let's provide at the barest minimum 4 kosas for the balabayas. Again, that's a real push in Tosas. Tosas seems to say that there's no difference between Dalit Kosos and Kiddush. And that's very different. So I will say this is where we're going to stop for today. And try to be in touch with you. And we'll see what we're doing tomorrow.